Hello, and we're recording with Project Chimps. This is our quarterly book club, and to this book club, everybody watched The Elephant in the Living Room, which is a documentary, not a book, but we wanted to mix it up. And with us here today is Pat Craig of the Wild Animal Sanctuary. And I'm going to read a little introduction about him. But what's important to know is that the lions in in the movie ended up at his sanctuary, so he can tell us what happened to them, which I really want to know. That's like my biggest question, but we'll get there. So I'm going to read a little introduction about Pat. 41 years ago, Pat Craig had an audacious idea to rescue exotic animals living in inhumane conditions in the United States. Today, you can visit more than 550 rescued tigers, wolves, bears, and lions at the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado. When Pat Craig was 19, he visited a friend who worked as a zoo groundskeeper in North Carolina. His friend showed him the back of the zoo, where tigers and lions sat in small cages far away from the crowds. They were surplus animals, meaning the zoo had no place for them. Craig looked at the animals and was shocked by the scene. He didn't think he would even put a dog in the cages where the lions and tigers lived. He climbed into his blue Chevy pickup, leaving the zoo behind him in his rearview mirror as he returned home to Boulder, Colorado. But the animals had curled up in the forefront of his thoughts. And there they lingered. Every day I kept thinking about them as I went back to school at University of Colorado Boulder, he says. I thought, how many people think like I do and are not doing anything about it? So today, Pat runs a wild animal sanctuary in Keensburg, Colorado, the world's largest and oldest nonprofit sanctuary dedicated exclusively to rescuing large carnivores that have been abused, abandoned, or illegally kept. So, Pat, that's quite a story, and it seems like it jumped from having the idea to starting the sanctuary. That's like huge gap, which we'll get into. But first of all, what happened to the lions from the movie?
Well, the lions from the movie still live here, so that's the good news. Is they live in large acreage habitats and have since they arrived. So that's been a really nice thing to watch them, especially the two young ones that were little and have grown up into big lions now, and so they're great to see. And their mom Lacey is still doing really well, and so it's a nice thing. It's been quite a few years, and but they really evolved and love their life that they have now.
I was
Awesome.
fortunate enough to visit your sanctuary in May of this year, Pat, and the amount of space that the animals have to roam around is extraordinary. And I also found it really interesting that I was up on the walkway above where the residents were, and they didn't even seem to notice that I was there. Didn't have any care at all that there were any people there. They were just more concerned with roaming around their area. And I had gotten there right after the bears had come out in the spring.
Nice.
And so they were very busy eating and swimming, and it was very, very nice.
No, that's
Huge
great.
facility. Yeah.
No, thanks.
So what is their life like on a daily basis now?
Well, our sanctuary, that's goes to what Catherine was saying. Our sanctuary is pretty unique in the sense of the size of the habitats that we provide the animals. When I first started rescuing animals, back then all the laws required you to keep them in cages with concrete floors and steel bars or chain link and a
Mhm.
roof over it, and it was very inhumane. It didn't matter how big you made it; it still was just a really unnatural setting. So I worked with the state and the federal government for years to get them finally to change the laws to allow for large natural habitats like what we do. And so ever since then, that's been our goal, is to make sure every animal that we do rescue gets to live in a much more natural setting than it ever was wherever it came from. And so most of our habitats range anywhere from 5 acres to 20 here in the Keansburg location. And then down in our sanctuary that's in southern Colorado, some of the habitats are up to 300 acres in size, and so most of
Wow.
those down there range about 45 to 300 acres. Sorry.
That's okay. I've got dogs too. Um, it's amazing that uh, we can provide, like you guys can provide such massive amount of acreage because you know I don't. I'm glad you guys got worked with the government officials to get the law changed because
Um,
just the dire circumstances as illustrated in the movie, but then that's just one example.
um,
There's tons of other scenarios where um, the same thing is happening, and who knows? Maybe they might not even had a cage for the lion as seen in the movie, but it has the law changed? I know it changed since the movie in Ohio for the circumstances, but has the law changed everywhere where that's illegal to have exotic animals?
well, it's changed in Ohio, like you said, and it's changed in most states. There's
Mhm,
still a couple states left. I think North Carolina and might be Kentucky, and then I think maybe Alaska. But there's a few states that still haven't changed it, and
mhm,
so that's really part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that each state varies. So some states are very strict, like Colorado and California, and where you can't have them regardless what you do. But
mm.
other states, it's you got to be licensed and do all sorts of things, and then it gets to some states where it's just pay a $10 fee for a permit, and then you can have one. So all those laws are good, but they vary in severity and how good they regulate. So it's still a step in the right direction to make it something that's got to be registered and counted. Because in Ohio, that was one of the problems is there was just so many exotics and they didn't have a clue how many people had them and where they were or anything. And they knew it was a big problem, but yet there was no statistics to go with that.
It's always surprising
Right.
to me, the statistics, like more tigers living in the state of Texas than in
Mhm.
India, or at least they estimate. And we've even had some experiences here in our area of people saying, "Oh, we've seen mountain lions, here in our county," and oh no, no, they're not native here. And I'm thinking, they're sort of everywhere, and you just don't know it.
Yeah, yeah. There's actually a lot of people that just turn them loose when they get them and try to have them as a pet, and it doesn't work out. Rather than getting in trouble, they'll just go out in the woods and turn something loose. And so there's quite a few exotic animals in pretty remote areas around the country where they're actually living and surviving, and obviously some starve and die, but we've run
Wow.
into lots of reports.
What a mentality, and that came to light in the movie when, the police officer, Tim, was in the woods, like, scoping out, trying to find, one of the animals that had gotten loose. I can't remember what it was, if it was
Cougar.
a cougar. It was a cougar, right? And he's in the woods, and he's contemplating. Now, this sounds crazy, but he's contemplating, is it should I catch him? Because will he get the cougar get a life any better? Will he just die? Or, he's got a taste of freedom now. But, the problem is the reality is that cougar could kill somebody, that cougar could hurt themselves. It just goes snowballs. And it's a situation that is I didn't understand until I watched the movie, like, how serious and how, huge the exotic animal population is in the United States. Has that number gone down, Pat? Like, has that improved, or is people still have exotic animals? I think from the statistics I could find that was still around 2016, so they're not recent, is that 13% of the US households owned an exotic pet.
Right.
It's huge.
Yeah,
That's
and when
crazy.
they talk about that, I think they're talking about everything from iguanas to
Mhm.
you know, lots of different weird little chinchillas and sugar
Mhm.
gliders and all sorts of things. Obviously, not everybody has a lion or a tiger, but Ohio was one of the states that started to have auctions, and that's what really kind of made it balloon so large in that area. And so there was other parts of the countries where these normally cattle and horse auction houses started to just cater to the exotic animals and have people come from all over the country and bring their exotic animal babies, from lions and tigers to chimps to you name it. And people would go in there mostly out of curiosity, but then they'd see a little baby lion or tiger and think, oh my gosh, I gotta hold it and pet it. And next thing you know, they'd buy it and take it home. And
Mhm.
so we do have a film on our website that was done by 60 Minutes Australia, and they talked to some people in Ohio that did that exact same thing and kind of followed them through their story. So the auctions really made that escalate quite a bit in certain states and certain areas. But at one point, there was well over 25,000 lions and tigers and bears outside the zoo system in the United States. It's gone down, but we had a resurgence not long ago with Tiger King and
Mm-hmm.
all the people that were in Tiger King, that Netflix story that featured the people like Joe Exotic, who would breed, anywhere from 70 to 150 to 200 baby tigers a year just to fuel his petty and photo op business that he did with them. People would pay a lot of money to just be able to hold a baby tiger and take a picture with them. And so there was a number of, like at least 5 or 6 really big breeders in the United States that were doing that photo op kind of thing. And they were escalating the breeding again tremendously, So the auctions did it for a while and then it kind of tapered down. But then that was the new, more recent thing that caused a huge population of explosion in the exotics.
So Tiger King? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so we obviously only have chimpanzees here at our sanctuary. So,
Mm-hmm.
and chimps are, different than big cats, I suppose, still exotic. But for the most part, we know where all of the chimpanzees are in the country. It's well
Mm-hmm.
documented, whether they're privately owned or in sanctuary or in zoos.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have similar databases like that to know where the larger carnivores are?
Well, there's obviously the roadside zoos that have to get USDA licensed because they exhibit, and so that helps track a certain number of them. But the private owners, because that was one of the things that made tigers, especially such a problem in the United States, was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife originally considered all tigers, to be endangered. And 40 years ago, when I got started, that was right about the time that they were like, oh, well, there's these what they call generic tigers, which means people have bred a Bengal with a Sumatran or an Indo-Chinese and created basically a mutt, like a dog mutt, but it still
Mm-hmm.
looks like a tiger. And zoos were guilty of that too, because in the early 1900s, tigers weren't endangered, and the zoos that got them would typically just trade with another zoo. Hey, we'll send our female and you swap with your male, and so they actually inbred them as well. And so most of the tigers that were in the zoo system were also generic tigers. And so the Fish and Wildlife, their charge is animals in the wild. They want to help, preserve endangered species in the wild and protect them. And so they saw these tigers, these generic tigers, as just being pointless to them and what they did. And so they kind of just washed their hands and said, we're not going to regulate them. And so that opened the door for everybody and his brother to start breeding tigers in the United States. And as you mentioned, at one point there were 7,000 tigers in Texas alone,
Mm-hmm.
which was way
Wow.
more than what was in the wild. It's gone down, but still there's definitely somewhere between 5,500 and 7,500 tigers in the United States that are outside of the zoo system, and so that's still a big problem. But that doesn't count lions or bears or other things. But the databases just aren't there for all those privately held ones. Those are where all these people get one in a state and put it in their backyard, and nobody knows it's there. And then if they get two, and a male and female, start breeding and then trading and selling, and then there's people like the Tiger King guys who were fudging their records. They were totally, it was all just lies on there. They were documenting the animals that were right there on site, but all the babies that were being born, they weren't recording those so that they would just be off the record. And so then those spread out throughout the United States, and nobody knew where they went. And so it's a
Mm.
mess.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing about Elephant in the Living Room is the lines at the end went to your sanctuary and it
Mhm.
promoted that was the only solution. And I think we can all agree that's the best solution. But how do we get that awareness that that is the solution to
Mhm.
people who call themselves animal lovers? Because we saw it
Mhm.
in the movie with Terry. He's an animal lover, but
Mhm.
he just not, you know,
Yeah.
planning the for the future.
Yeah.
is eventually where the police officer got him, look,
Hmm.
you're not going to be around forever and you got
Yeah.
to do something. Um, but so he eventually did the responsible thing, but is it education? Is it just
Hmm.
laws alone? What is it that
Yeah.
helps make the sanctuary the solution?
Well, it's really education because, like
Mm-hmm.
say we can pass laws, but people, break them all the time and do like those other guys who were licensed but still fudge their records. And so really it's about people who drive that demand. So like those photo op people made money because people couldn't resist holding a baby tiger or paying money to hold one or take a picture with one. And most people that did that kind of thing, the vast majority would do it on a whim, and then maybe the next day or a week later, they'd think, gee, I wonder where those cubs are going to go. What happened to those cubs? Or maybe I start to get concerned then, where their concern should have been when they heard that there was a photo op, and said, well, wait a minute, what do they do with those that they use for those? Are they going somewhere that's reputable and a good place for them? And even then, is that really the right reason to breed tigers when you're not trying to help the ones in the wild? And
Mm-hmm.
so educating people is really important to just make sure they understand the really bad repercussions that happen to these animals. And so when people visit our sanctuary, our trail book has every story in there. When you read these story after story after story of these animals, just like what happened with Terry's lions and everybody else's, you realize these animals suffered and obviously some died and that should have never happened and it was preventable. And
Hmm.
so that's truly the thing is to stop the driving, the consumerism that kind of drives that breeding.
Right.
So that's something that always comes back to our discussion group, no matter what book we read or thing that
Yeah.
we discuss, is what can we do? And it always comes back to education. So that's sort of why we're here and why we wanted to meet with you and why we chose a film this time instead of a book, because your staff was also very generous to share some book ideas with us, which were
Mhm.
also very good, and I purchased those as well. But I wanted to include the non-readers
Yeah.
in the ability to discuss with us some of the problems that animals are facing everywhere, and different ways to educate people. So
Hmm.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Catherine and I were talking before you got on, Pat, about how uh, it seems that the way the movie happened, it was so like, okay, first there's the lion escapes,
Hmm.
and attacking cars, and
Hmm.
then uh the lion gets the other lion pregnant, and then there's cubs, and then there's electrocution, and it's just like
Hmm.
crazy series of events
Hmm.
that's just one illustration of a set of animals in crazy circumstances. I bet you see other circumstances. Are they just as crazy, or what other situations have you seen?
Yeah, they're just really almost endless. The crazy stories that we've done, especially I've done
Mm.
this 42 years now, and um, it's I don't think I can even think of one where I ran into that was normal, if you could call it
Yeah, what is that anyway?
what's normal. But no, the craziest stuff that you've ever seen. When we rescued lions out of Mexico that were kept in concrete pits outside Mexico City, and they would go into the Mexico City because there's 21 million stray dogs in Mexico City, and they just round up stray dogs and feed them to the lion. And
Oh.
we found a lion, two tigers, and a mountain lion underneath the crawl space of a house where the guy had got the lion as a cub, and then when it got big and was tearing up the house, he didn't have a place to put it, and so he didn't even build a cage. He just put it in the crawl space under his house and put a little grate there where he could throw in some meat and put the garden hose under there to give him some water. And so then he thought, well, tigers are nice, so he got a couple of tiger cubs and had those. And then when they grew up and tore up everything, then he put them under there. And then he thought, well, my mountain lion's maybe not so crazy. I'll get a mountain lion. So he raised this mountain lion, and it was the same. So he put it down there, and they were living in total darkness other than that little grate of light underneath the house. And it wasn't until the neighbors heard the muffled roaring of the lion that they thought it was like a cow or a bull or
Mhm.
anyway. So eventually they thought, well, this is just too weird, and called the Division of Wildlife. And then they found out that that's what was going on. So, that was just such an extreme thing to try to do, is thinks he's going to keep these, full grown large carnivores in this 3 foot crawl space underneath his house. And so then we had to go there and obviously get them out, which was very challenging, of course. But there's just one after another, after another, after another, stories that are just unbelievable.
It
I
makes
even
me
have a
also.
story. Oh, go
Oh,
ahead,
I'm
Catherine.
sorry. Go ahead. Oh, I was gonna ask you, with all of these different rescues that you do, what kind of health conditions do the animals come to you with? I mean, are these private owners able to provide proper care, proper nutrition for the animals that they keep?
Yeah, and it's almost non-existent. I mean, obviously, every time we go into a place, the animals haven't been fed a proper diet, and most of them have problems, either bone malformations, or in the case of the lions in Ohio with this elephant in the living room, the, one of the cubs died because it had a lack of vitamin A, and
Okay.
all three had a lack of vitamin A, but one of them died from a problem that is a result of that. And so, it's just constantly when we go anywhere, and even some of these fairly reputable places and roadside zoos and other places where they still, they're feeding roadkill and whatever else they can find, and not adding any kind of vitamins or minerals or anything else to balance the diets. And there's almost always no medical care, zero medical care, and that's one of the biggest problems. Is so many of these animals get sick, and then they just let these animals suffer and die, and that was one of the things that happened with this case as well.
I was gonna say I have a story about witnessing a neighbor with a wild cat. I don't know if it was a cougar or a mountain lion, but this was in the Pacific Northwest, and
Mm-hmm.
my neighbor had this. It was behind my house quite a ways, but he had this basement, daylight basement, and he converted into like this den for this mountain lion. You could drive by and see it through the window, like looking out. And I'd just be like, holy cow, that thing's gonna get out one day.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually had this run, like like a line where he put it on a chain and it could run up
Mm-hmm.
and down outside.
Mm-hmm.
And no fence, nothing, just that. Anyway, eventually the den was empty and I was like, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know the guy well enough and it was too creepy for me to like go over there and say, hey, what happened?
Yeah.
But probably a couple of weeks after, I was driving probably, I don't know, 7 miles away on the way to town, and in this field, I think I saw it, like,
Yeah.
just sitting there, and
Yeah.
I called the police because there was, like, a big cat, in the field, but I
Right.
still don't, to this day, do not know what happened,
Yeah.
and you've probably seen enough to know that
Mm-hmm.
story over and over again, what happened.
Yeah. And that's usually how we find out about these animals, is something like that happens where it escapes, and then
Mhm,
we get called. And just like with Terry's lions, where he was out on the interstate biting cars, and
mhm,
then concerned people called us and said, hey, there's this lion that escaped, and they were able to get it back, but yet it turns out this guy has no way to keep these animals contained right, and now they're living in a horse trailer, and that
right.
kind of thing. And that just
Ugh.
happens over and over. But that's really how we find out about them, is something goes wrong, which it always does,
Mhm.
and then
It
we
Yeah.
always does.
kind of put them
Tim
on the.
actually, yeah, made mention that there are no good endings.
Right.
Mhm.
There are no winners here, especially when it comes to the animals.
Right.
Just out of curiosity, do you ever have any previous owners come and visit the animals?
You know, probably, I'd say 60, 70, 80% of them swear they're going to. But very rarely. I've had maybe a couple over the years that actually finally showed up to see their animal, because we always offer it. We don't want to hold that back from those people, and of course they can't go in and play with them or whatever. But we do want them to see their animals, and know that they're doing well, and so we invite everybody. And there was one of the people from Ohio. It was a different case where bears came and saw their bear, and then there was a guy that came who had a mountain lion for years, and he came a few times. And but for the most part, they'll say they will, but they don't really care that much. And that's usually the thing that always defines it, is when people asked how to stop this problem, and they were trying to pass laws and certain states were just really resilient about not wanting to pass laws about banning it. And so one of our suggestions was to, require insurance and liability insurance, and that way, if the animal ever escaped and hurt somebody, then they at least have some insurance for the victim and whatever. And that was all sounded great for the victims if there was ever going to be any, and for the protection of the public. But really, what I knew was that most of these people, the minute that their animal is going to cost them some sort of extra money,
Mhm.
even though they swear they love them and they would die, you know, protecting them, the minute they say, oh, well, you're going to have to buy $200 a year in extra insurance, they're like, oh no, come get it. The minute that it costs them money, they want to get rid of it. And so that actually worked in a couple of states where they
Hmm.
put in liability insurance, and about 3/4 of the people instantly wanted to get rid of their animals because it was going to cost them a couple $100 a year.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think Elephant in a Living Room did a good job of showing the humanness of the situation, and it's more about the humans, unfortunately, than the
Mm-hmm.
animals, because it showed, Terry and his situation and how much Terry did love those animals and he
Mm-hmm.
did all he could do. Then it showed, the police officer and um how he was torn because he had a friend that had been killed by one of these animals and then had been around them so much and then
Mm-hmm.
sees the outcomes and it's never good. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just emotionally wrenching watching the whole
Mm-hmm.
thing. And
Yeah.
it reminded me like how stupid humans are. This is such a human problem.
It is a human,
We're
yeah.
encroaching on their territory,
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tim
and
even says in the documentary, we don't have an animal problem, we have a people problem,
yeah.
which I think is really great. Why,
Mhm.
Pat, why do you think that people seek out exotic animals for ownership?
Right.
What is the drive?
Well, there's definitely a fascination. A lot of people ask us about what our position is on zoos and today, and I always tell them that when zoos started, very very few people back in the 1800s could travel. Only very wealthy people could afford to travel around the world and see things like go to Africa, and so most people would have their only access to animals was a book, and most of those were a black and white sketch of a giraffe or a zebra or whatever. And so when zoos came about, it was really a great way for people to actually see some of these animals from around the world and be inspired to go, wow, look at all these different creatures. They're so different than what we have here. And it was very educational and all that. And regardless whether it was, good for the animals or not, there seemed to be a driving purpose behind that to inspire people to realize that there's really amazing creatures and we should protect them. But then obviously fast forward to today, and a lot of people ask about what about today, and all I can say is my personal opinion is with ultra high definition TVs and Planet Earth and places like these filmers that go out and spend years trying to capture the most rare animals there are. We see behaviors and animals doing things you would never see in a zoo for sure. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Let alone um, some of the things that they document the behaviors and then seeing them up close and how beautiful they are. And it's so much different and so much more inspiring to me to see that than it would be to just see that animal in a cage in a zoo. And so, I don't know whether, I think there are some zoos. Ohio has the Wilds, I think it's called, and there's a few places like that that have very large habitats, kind of like what we offer, but in a zoo setting. And so it is possible to maybe balance it to where the animals have a much better life and yet still serve some purpose to inspire people to want to care about saving these animals. And that's really the purpose, is to try and save these animals. And if you have to do it that way. And again, that was one of the only reasons that we ever opened to the public, because we first 20 years we weren't open to the public, and
Mm.
we just wanted to protect the animals. And then we realized that people didn't get educated, that we were going to never win this battle. And as you talked about, the walkway was really critical for us because that was the only way we could really open to the public and not hurt the animals and put pressure on them. Anyway, so these animals that are out there, they're wonderful animals, but yet people have to care, and really
Hmm.
want to save them.
One thing that I remember from doing research prior to coming out to your facility was the number of people that were saying, oh, geez, the way that the animals behave at your facility compared to a zoo or another smaller facility is remarkable, the difference, because they have so much space and they don't feel like people are encroaching on their area or their territory, and so they don't have that pacing or that stereotypical behavior to self-soothe
Right.
in, conditions that aren't natural to them. So a wonderful facility that you have providing that opportunity for them. We strive for the same thing here, not
Yeah.
forcing the chimps to do anything. We don't
Right.
force them to be on display, and we don't force them to participate in anything that they don't want to. And so I think
Yeah.
that's really important for the animals in captivity.
It is. Yeah. Making sure that that weird pressure's not there. I always tell people if you went home every night and sat down in your living room and you were going to eat dinner or watch TV and there was 20 people standing at your living room window looking at you, tapping on the glass and just talking and pointing and drive you nuts. And that's exactly what these animals put up with is, people that they don't know. These are all strangers to them and not the caretakers and that kind of thing. And so it's really um, hard for people to imagine that. But if you put them in that kind of situation, they would get it instantly how difficult that is for the animals.
Does it take a while for the residents to become accustomed to your facility, or do they settle
Mm-hmm.
in pretty quickly?
Well, that's a good question. There's two parts to it. One is the animals that are here. They kind of create this amazing vibe, if you want to call it that, where they're all very happy because they've gone through the transition and they're living their life. And so it's always kind of fun to watch new animals coming in that are like nervous or scared or whatever. And typically a large carnivore, if they're afraid, will want to strike out or be aggressive back or whatever. And so a lot of times you'll see a tiger or a lion, growling and like defending himself to somebody that's next door, and the animal next door just goes, "Ah, get over it. A week from now, you're going to realize this is great. You're going to love it." So they don't even reflect that energy back to them. So those animals that transition really quickly because there's no aggression, like, oh, here's a new guy, and everybody comes over, kind of like if you went to the dog park, and all that dog would come up to the new dog, and there's none of that. So the animals that come here transition way faster just because of that energy is different. But the habitats is really what makes a big difference to all the animals here, and having the space to go do whatever they want
To
and not
run.
stuck in a small. They can run, they can play, they can they can go on the ground, they can go swim in lakes, they can whatever they want to do, and it's really makes a difference from the life that they had because all of them came from very constricted spaces and usually very unnatural kind of background.
We've noticed that with the chimps too,
Mm-hmm.
since we have more residents now.
Mm-hmm.
The new chimps that arrive here are welcomed. It seems as though the current residents are saying, "Hey, we're
Yep.
so glad you're here. You made it. This is such a great place. You're gonna love it."
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so different than from when the first residents arrived and how afraid they were.
Yeah.
Not that new residents aren't afraid, also,
Yeah.
but it's just like now they can see some of the faces that they recognize from
Mm-hmm.
the lab, and
Mm-hmm.
they realize that they're in a good place and they settle in pretty quickly. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
And it's so awe-inspiring. I mean, I had shivers when the males were going outside for the first time the other week.
Yeah.
And as a filmmaker and as a filmmaker for Project Chimps, I only want to make inspiring
Mm-hmm.
footage,
It was
camera
all
off the
inspiring.
default. Yeah. And I'm just so horrified at things like the Tiger King and other
Mm-hmm.
shows that are taking advantage of it for entertainment, and
Right.
then you wonder what's happening behind the scenes to these animals. That just horrifies me.
Yep.
What do you think that uh there is there a way to I think making inspiring movies, like you say, and photo ops where you
Mm-hmm.
can be inspired, but is there any other way to get the message out that how inspiring these animals are? Like, is there any advocacy or any other organizations you recommend?
I know there's a lot of places try to do their best, and even us, we for years we're always so busy, like most sanctuaries or other places that have animals where you're caring for the animals and going out on rescues, I get back after rescue, and we swore we took cameras with us, but nobody had the time to actually pick it up and film anything. And so there's literally hundreds of rescues that we've done that were never documented because
Mm.
just everybody was busy. And it wasn't until, I don't know, probably 6 years ago or so that we
Mhm.
finally had the resources to hire a film company that goes on rescues with us as well as films here and creates very
Oh,
inspiring
cool.
not really documentaries, but pieces, everything from short little pieces to stories about specific animals. And that has really helped tremendously to kind of get the message out to people. And it's something that we knew a long time ago that would have helped, but we just didn't really have the resources to do it. And so I think that it's great that, that you have resources to do that. And I know that all sanctuaries, at least in small facilities, try to do it. But again, they're all in that same boat where either they can't afford really good equipment or can't afford somebody to produce those things or edit them or any of that. So, everybody does what they can, but I think that's really the key is if people could get the stories about what their work is out more, it would help
Mhm.
tremendously.
Um, I know myself, and I hadn't ever worked with a sanctuary prior to being here at Project Chimps, and
Mhm.
I know that I would have gotten duped by one of these roadside zoos thinking it was a good place. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I like to tell people all the time is look for a GFAS accredited
Mhm.
sanctuary.
Right.
And for anybody that ends up listening to this later, that's the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And if a facility is accredited by that entity, then
Mhm.
you can rest assured that those animals are receiving the absolute best captive care that we can possibly provide.
Right.
So that's one of the things that people can do. I know you also have a great volunteer program. I'm the volunteer coordinator at Project Chimps, and so that was one of
Mhm.
the things I wanted to talk about and ask your staff. And so that's awesome. Have you been able to reach any new audiences with your volunteer crew to get more word out about proper animal care
Mhm.
and
Yeah, the volunteers prior to being open to the public were critical to be able to go out and make presentations and spread the word that way. But that was one of the things that we realized where, it seemed like we were just barely making a dent talking to 30 people at a time or 60 people at a time. And you think I need to be talking to 60,000 people at a time. And because getting this word around the United States is going to be really hard. And so that was really what drove us to finally open to the public was knowing that we could do mass amounts of people. So we get over 160,000 visitors a year to the sanctuary here. And our volunteers now spend half of their volunteer time on that walkway talking to visitors. And so they're still educating visitors, they're still presenting everything that they would have anyway. But it's really engaging to be able to actually point to an animal and say, look at this animal here, and explain their background and where they came from and how they've changed and improved over time. And so really, we just kind of opened to be able to mass produce this, but we had to do it with the walkway so that there was no impact to the animals. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that I want to encourage anybody that does, tries to help animals in that way is, you have to make the commitment to say, you can't just say, well, that's going to be expensive or that's going to be a lot of work. You have to just say, you know what, that's what's right for the animals, and I got to find a way to do that. And I knew right from the first animal I rescued that keeping them in a small cage wasn't an improvement in their life at all. I might have saved them from being killed, but they had no better life than they had when they were in the zoo to begin with. And
mhm.
so right there, I made the commitment to say whatever it takes to get more land and get more space and be able to put them into a natural space. And same thing with the education when it came time to educate to build that entire walkway. It's a mile and a half, over a mile and a half long, and it took an insane amount of resources and time and energy to build it, but it was the right thing for the animals. And so, I always want to encourage people to say, if you know what's right for the animals, then find a way to make that happen, and don't just go, well, we can't make that happen because we don't have the money or we don't have the people to make it. It's just something that if you have the will, there's a way to get it done.
Uh, you mentioned the getting the animals out of the cage. I went to the big cat sanctuary in Florida
Mhm.
a couple of years ago, and they have one of the cages that is like the legal size to
Right.
house a tiger, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not much bigger than a dog kennel. I
No.
mean,
Wow.
well, I mean, and by that I mean a dog crate, not a dog kennel, not a
Mhm.
dog run, but a
Right.
dog crate. They're not big at all. They can bear. I don't even know if they can turn around.
Yeah, and that when Holly gave the intro, she talked about that I saw the back of the zoo and that they had their
Mhm.
lions and tigers in cages I wouldn't even keep a dog in,
Hmm.
and that's really how most zoos the back is. Those
Yeah.
animals hopefully are out on display and in the big enclosures, but there's always a lot of surplus in the back, and it's much better than it was when I started. But really, truly, people would be shocked to see the size of the cages that most of these animals, when they go off exhibit, live in. They're just tiny. They're smaller than a quarter of a bedroom. You know what I mean? And they're just,
Wow.
yeah, and they're concrete, and it's just such an unnatural thing. And so, if they're only in there for a couple hours, well, maybe that's okay. But there's ones that actually live there for years at a time.
Do you have a favorite animal or a favorite story?
Well, it's kind of nice to talk to you in the sense that I always want to tell people that these big cats are really smart. And a lot of them, especially what I would say is the smartest, is a jaguar. And I always tell people that jaguars are basically chimps in a cat body. They're incredibly, incredibly smart. They can open. That was one of the first ones I ever rescued, and this female jaguar lived with me for 24 years while I was doing this rescuing, and she could open house door, cars doors. Her food was kept in the refrigerator. She would open the refrigerator, slide the tray out, eat her food, put it back, close the door. I mean, just incredible stuff that had she had an opposable thumb, she probably would have been considered a chimpanzee. But
We
but
know.
yeah,
We're there.
they're amazing.
Ours have
Yeah,
thumbs.
yeah. So I can only imagine actually trying to take care of chimps because when I first started rescuing these animals, especially the big cats, I realized that they were way ahead of me, and I needed to hurry up and find a way to outsmart them because they were so much smarter at the beginning and knew everything I was going to do before I ever did it, and very intelligent in that way, where they pick up on your habits and your strengths and your weaknesses and things like that. And so, I think when people start to work with exotic animals, they realize real quick that it's a whole different world than a dog or a cat.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time the chimps know everything about you before
Mm-hmm.
you ever even open your
Mm-hmm.
mouth. They can
Yeah.
read your body language like
Oh
nothing
yeah.
else.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. Um, anyway, the story up in Ohio with Terry was, like you said, the producers really wanted to tell that human side, which I think they did a really good job of showing. And I think Michael Weber, that was the producer, wanted to do was to show how Terry perceived what he was
Mhm.
doing and all that. So that was really, I guess, a good thing for a lot of people. I don't know whether it really convinced people they shouldn't do it, but what it was, the movie did convince people was, he didn't have the resources to have these animals, and that's really the bottom line with all the ones that we go rescue is people that you know, have an animal and they probably love it and they want to do right, but they just don't have the resources to do what's really needed, and so that's why the animals always end up, suffering and dying, and in his case, there was a lot of really bad things with the male being electrocuted and there was one cub that died from the vitamin A deficiency, and the other two were in pretty bad shape when we got them, but then they obviously recovered. And same thing with the female, the mother of the two was, really malnourished. And but that's the thing is hopefully that movie portrayed that to people as, that Terry really failed them when it came time to give them the kind of uh, life they needed, to live in captivity.
Yeah.
I think most people see that with cats and dogs, with the
Mhm.
shelter situations and just these dire situations
Mhm.
where they have to give up their animal or they just
Mhm.
let it out in the forest. And that's maybe all that people see. But I think with the movie, apply that to exotics, and it's a
Mhm.
whole other set of danger and
Mhm.
circumstance that's way more bigger and problematic
Right.
than just cats and dogs, so
Right.
and seeing Terry and his real love for those animals, and also um his dependence on them for
Mhm.
his PTSD, his
Mhm.
health problems. you know I get they were essentially his emotional support
Mhm.
animals, but yeah, it like where's the line between having a lion to do that and then a dog, you know? It's really
It's a
sad.
simple line. It's
Mhm.
simple. Speaking of PTSD, the residents that live here at our facility were all used in medical research. So they were all kept in medical labs across the country.
Mhm.
Um, and most of them, maybe all of them, have some level of PTSD when they arrive here. Do your residents suffer the same?
Oh yeah. No, there's definitely ones that have been traumatized and come in with way more emotional baggage or you know, psychosomatic stuff that they display because of what they've gone through than other ones that were luckily intervened early. You know, we've rescued young animals before where they were just a few months old, so they've been got the benefit of getting here early enough that they didn't go through those things. And but some of them have been through really bad things, and the great news is some of the most aggressive ones that come in, some of our volunteers or staff that are new will be like, oh my God, this one, I don't think this one's ever going to get better. And I always go, no, they always do. They always do. It's just that one's going to take a little more time to realize that not everybody, is bad, and that all those ghosts and demons from the past are going to fade away, and they'll be all right in the long run. And they always do. Years later, you never realize that those animals were ever aggressive or ever had any kind of emotional problems. But yeah, they all, I would say, I'd say at least 50% come in with some form of, of
Mm.
distress from what they had.
I'm so glad that they recover. That's
Yeah,
wonderful to hear. Yeah.
yeah.
It is. That's so
Mhm.
cool. And we've seen that with chimps that are that there's just a few of them, but some of them don't want to come outside. They're so scared of
Mhm.
outside because
Mhm.
it's so different. They're just used to the being
Cage.
inside and
Yeah.
in the cage and the yeah. And it when you do see them just venture out a little bit, it's so cool because
Yeah.
they're just, they're just about to make that decision and then they do. But they
Mhm.
might not stay out for long, but it's so cool to see.
Yeah. And we have a rehabilitation process. I'm sure that chimps do the same thing, and we don't just dump them out into a large 40-acre habitat and go, there you go, you're free, because they're terrified,
No.
of course, and just like what you were talking about. And so we have a whole system of how we introduce our animals into spaces, and then also as well as to other animals. And because most of the animals that we take in are large carnivores, and people think about, oh, most of those live solitary in the wild, like tigers and mountain lions and things like that, and really that's just based on the food and supply in the wild. And so obviously in a captive setting they get plenty of food, and but they still have those same fears of being hurt by another animal, and defending their territory and all the things that their natural instincts are. And so you just have to know what those are and how you're going to offset those fears and intrepidation to go out and do something or whatever. And so we start with small and build up from there and get bigger. I'm sure that's similar to what you guys do. And um, but in the long run, then they can actually build their confidence and their character, and then it's really great to see that happen, because that's when they start to really enjoy life. Is instead of being afraid of their own shadow all the time, they start to
Mhm.
be confident and wanting to do things, and that's when each personality starts to really come out, and you can tell the difference between each one of them from their personalities.
People are always amazed that the chimps have different personalities. And I'm like,
Yeah.
or that they know their names. And I
Right.
always think,
And all their nicknames.
yeah, do your dogs know their name? And are
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
different from one another? But
Yeah.
Pat, I hope that someday you'll come and see our facility and meet our residents. I know that I thoroughly enjoyed your facility and your residents, so that
Thank
was
you.
wonderful. Holly,
Yeah.
do you have anything else while we're chit
I
chatting?
just want to say we do have an introduction video on our YouTube channel that shows how new chimps are introduced to the
That's great.
group. And so that's gives people behind the scenes taste of how that process is done because we have um, a behaviorist that works,
Mhm.
ensure that it's the least traumatic possible for the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah. And you do have to realize that just like a child growing up, you do have to push their limits so that they do grow, and
Hmm.
you can't just always overprotect them. Just like some parents can be overprotective sometimes, and their children don't grow as much, and so it is important for the people that are rehabbing these animals to to understand that and to push them a little bit here and there to make sure that they do grow and do kind of learn more about the world than what they understood it as.
Well, and I imagine like chimpanzees who need enrichment and need to keep their minds going. I imagine it's the same thing with big cats. Like, what do you guys do enrichment? Do you have certain activities or things that they do?
We do for the ones that are, in the more like when they first come in, they're in a smaller space. If they're going to be there for a while, like some of these have medical conditions that need treated
Mhm.
for a while, then we do have lots of things that we interact with them and everything from the sense and the searching and finding things to everything from mirrors to you name it. There's the
Mhm.
standard set of things that people do, but really, once they start to move into the habitats and be with others, that's really the key. At that point, that's all their enrichment is. They just love their space and they go explore and they interact with each other and they just start to make that their own space like they would in the wild. The only difference is they just don't have to hunt for food, but everything else can be very similar to what they would do.
That's so awesome. You guys have that space for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It has been an honor and a pleasure to a privilege to speak with you today, Pat. I so appreciate you taking this time to talk with our group and have this discussion. I'm sorry that we've been having technical difficulties, which prevented some of the exterior comments. Hopefully, we were able to ask many of the questions that those watching wanted to ask.
Yeah.
But if ever you find yourself in our area, we hope that you stop on by,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for the time today. And hopefully it helped inspire everybody to keep learning on your program that you have.
Agree. Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Pat, for inspiring time. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Check them out at the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado. Doing great work there. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You
Bye.
too. See ya.